All right, welcome to this first ever Boston Indicators video briefing. We give lots of presentations over the course of the year, and this is a new experiment with trying to make some of them available online. We'd love any feedback you've got, and in particular, we'd love to hear ideas for future briefings. So, census data on race and ethnicity are invaluable for understanding who we are as a region, but we often lose sight of the fact that these data are also often quite imperfect. The 2020 census included some important changes that help us better understand our multi-ethnic, multiracial country, but other census practices have been leading to some misleading findings. And these issues are compounded by some traditional reporting practices that researchers like us often default to. So what I'm going to do in this briefing is walk through these issues and then end with one idea for an alternative approach to reporting race and ethnicity data. So let me start by telling a story about the reporting of 2020 census data for Boston's Black population. Upon release of 2020 data, we saw widespread local news coverage of Boston's Black population decline. In one sense, this framing told a very real story, but there's also a way in which it missed something broader. What was happening is that the common approach to reporting census data is to show race totals based only on people who select that race alone. Here's a screenshot of what the actual census questionnaire looks like. Respondents answer two questions, one on the left about whether or not someone has Latino or Hispanic ethnicity, and then one on the right about their race. The totals referenced in those previous stories were for only examples like this one, where the respondent identified only as Black and nothing else. Someone who's multiracial, Black and white, by contrast, would not have counted toward Boston's Black population total under that approach. And neither would someone who's Afro-Latino, selecting Black for their race and Latino for their ethnicity. This overuse of single race, non-Latino totals has always been a problem, but it's growing in magnitude as we're several decades into a new global wave of immigration and because more and more families are forming across racial lines. Think of someone like Barack Obama, who we shorthand as our nation's first Black president. Because he's mixed race, white, Black, this approach risks not counting him towards our nation's Black population total. Here's what a difference these reporting judges make for the city of Boston. Traditional reporting of 2020 census data understates Boston's Black population by almost 43,000 residents. A big part of this story for the city is our large Afro-Latino population. This also makes a big difference when tracking the city's white population, as many white residents are mixed race and don't get counted as white under the traditional approach. As a proportion, this actually makes the biggest difference for Native Americans, where Boston's Native American population estimate rises to almost 10,000 if you include people with mixed ethnic or racial backgrounds. Next, I'm going to describe a related issue with how the Census Bureau adjusts some people's responses after they've been submitted. This is kind of wonky stuff, but it is important, so bear with me, and I hope I can walk through this in a clear way. What's going on is that the Census Bureau assigns additional race selections to people whose write-in responses suggest different racial categories than the boxes they actually select. This became a much larger issue in 2020 with the new expanded write-in boxes below every race selection. This practice, which very few people know about, is leading to artificially low single race alone totals, and then that's paired with artificially high multiracial and some other race totals. Where this crops up most often is for people of Latino ethnicity, because the Census Bureau has a practice of assigning some other race to everyone who writes in a Latino-seeming country of origin. And here's an example. If someone is Afro-Latino from Cuba, they might select yes, Cuban on the ethnicity question, and Black or African American for their race, and write in Cuban in the write-in space. The Census Bureau's back-end coding practice then also adds some other race for this person in addition to Black. This person then gets counted as multiracial, even though that respondent may not have mixed parental lineage or may identify solely as Black. This all sounds in the weeds, and it kind of is, but the impact is very real. And it shows up in how you report the numbers. So the next table is going to show 3 different ways you can present the data for the city of Boston for each racial category. There's a lot going in this table, but I'll highlight a couple of key comparisons. So near the bottom, you can see the huge artificial spikes from 2010 to 2020 for some other race and multiracial. Now, again, to be clear, there's strong reason to believe these groups are actually growing on their own. It's just that this back-end coding practice is inflating this increase significantly. Based on all of this, it's now the case that some other race is reported as the second largest racial category as of the 2020 census. Here's the data for Massachusetts and a very similar picture for the nation overall. This practice is by far the biggest issue for some other race and Latinos, but it applies to all racial categories. And it's a rising concern based on the 2020 write-in additions for Black and white. For many countries, this might seem straightforward. For instance, someone from Nigeria being considered Black and someone from China being considered Asian. But I think this logic breaks down quickly because the United States is far from the only nation of immigrants. According to current practice, for instance, the census considers all people reporting British origins to be white and all people reporting South African origins to be Black. Here's an example of how someone who's Black from the UK would be treated by the Census Bureau. Even though this person identifies as Black, the census also tells us they're white. To the extent that racial categories are useful at all, it's clear that many people hailing from those countries may well be of different racial backgrounds than the single official one designated by the Census Bureau. This has created a big challenge for tracking multiracial population growth. Starting with 2020 data, we can't answer this really simple question. How many people themselves selected more than one race on the census? What this all adds up to is reporting of census data on race and ethnicity that commonly looks like the upcoming graph on the next slide. Race totals only reflect people who select that race alone. People of Latino ethnicity have been subtracted from race totals and are shown separately on the right-hand side. This approach gives Latino heritage a priority, as someone who's, say, Black and Latino will only show up here as Latino. And the totals conveniently add up to 100%. But the data don't have to be represented this way. Next, I'll show you one alternative that we've been experimenting with at Boston Indicators. This approach more simply displays what share of respondents report being in each category. Now, an obvious downside to this alternative is that totals add up to more than 100%, so it can feel a little messy. But maybe this isn't such a downside. People really do exist across these categories, so why pretend that they don't? Allowing someone who is Latino and white to show up in both places does feel like a better expression of these people's full identities. Also, by the way, you can see here the large spikes in some other race and multiracial, speaking back to the back-end coding issue I described earlier. To be clear, this isn't to say that we should never just look at people who identify with only one race or isolate the size of the non-Latino Black population. But experimenting with alternatives like the second one might in many instances lead to a better understanding of who we are as a city. So, thanks for following all the way along to the end. And again, we'd really love your feedback, so don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks.